All right, joining me now, as I said, Sky News Outsiders host extraordinaire Rowan Dean. I tell you, Rowan, I mean, Bercow, I heard someone refer to him today as a poisonous dwarf, someone who worked with him when he was in UK working as a staffer. But, I mean, it is extraordinary. He, in my view, has really debased the speakership pretty much from the get-go, certainly over the last 18 months, in the way he's machinated to keep the Remainers in the game. But in all of this, it's a terrible spectacle when a parliamentary democracy runs away from the vote on the floor of the Commons, but also runs away from the chance the people have to exercise their democratic will.
Yeah, well, precisely. This John Bercow character, he's the Speaker. I mean, it's utterly absurd. We all know the position of the Speaker is, and it's debated here frequently. We remember the same debates during the last few years about the ability of the Speaker, drawn from one party in Parliament, to represent, to not be biased and not to be unfair to the opposition. And most of our speakers are pretty good, and most of our speakers try and stick to that basic principle. This bloke is a complete comedian. He's made it very clear that he has no interest in Brexit ever occurring, and therefore he's using his position, Peter, and it's a powerful position because, as we saw today, he can just simply make up his mind like that. Oh, hang on, we're not going to debate this. Now, in this instance, he's correct in that he says there is precedent in the past that if the Speaker feels that it's no point having another debate again because it's going to be disruptive, sure. But he's just using every trick in the book to delay Brexit. And what we're seeing, Peter, is basically strip away all the shenanigans. People get very confused about what does this vote mean and what does that vote mean and what does this letter to the EU mean and all this. Strip it all away. And what you have is the people of Britain voted by a majority of over 1.5 million, or around 1.5 million, to leave the EU. That was it 3 years ago. But a large percentage of the Parliament, for whatever reasons, they're absolutely committed to staying in the EU. So it's very simple for them in positions of power to use the levers of power to pull this stunt or that stunt. We had a Tory, Oliver Letwin, throwing up a motion the other day which stymied what Boris Johnson was trying to do. You saw the look on Boris Johnson's face. He couldn't believe it. You also have a bunch of legislation, Peter, brought in by lefties like Tony Blair and I would say David Cameron wasn't much better, that have made the rules of Parliament very difficult and made it very difficult for Boris Johnson to just do what the people of Britain voted for. But here's the thing, Peter, I keep saying, I don't know if you remember that scene in A Fish Called Wanda where the steamroller was gradually coming down the road
yes,
like this. I think
that
Nigel Farage is sitting in that steamroller and he's just gradually coming down the road, because I can't see. Yes, there is a possibility that Boris Johnson might, for however he pulls it off in the next few days, with all these deals, and remember, all these deals have clauses which mean that it's another 18 months till this happens, or it's another 6 months till this happens, or this can be reviewed further down the line, or that will be looked at by some committee further down the line. So there's all these kind of complications to whatever deal he gets through. But let's say he does get a deal through. Let's say Britain does leave on the 31st. Then it's quite likely that Boris Johnson would call an election and say, look, I did it, and probably win that election and probably win it in his own right. But there's equally the chance that all these Bercows and Letwins and all these characters are so determined. Who knows what other stunts they have up their sleeve? They've already surprisingly managed to pull out the most surprising stunts. What else have they got up their sleeve? And if so, Peter, what then happens if Boris doesn't manage to get out on October the 31st, and let's remember he's already written a letter to the EU saying, oh, can we have till January or whatever. If he doesn't get out on October 31st, then we will see a general election at which his popularity will plummet, and either in coalition with Nigel Farage or Nigel Farage by himself, the same people, the 17.5 million people who voted for Brexit, will then put either Boris and Farage or Farage into Downing Street.
Yeah, the Remainers, in my view, are just looking for every excuse they can to machinate and extend this question, hoping that they'll get to a situation where the majority of Brits will say we got it wrong, we should remain. But in fact, it's going very much the other way from people I've spoken to in Britain over the last few days. It's very much those, they say, in their families and certainly in polls, that were for remaining have now gone completely the other way.
No question.
And, yeah, I think that's a real worry for them. Canada. So overnight we had a general election in Canada. Our dear friend blackface Justin Trudeau looks like he's been returned, but very narrowly. Looks like he'll fall actually into minority government. Now, that will be difficult for Canada because it will be a conga line of left-wing types that allow him to form enough of a majority to pass legislation. Of course, one of the key pushes from the Conservatives was to repeal the carbon tax, Trudeau's carbon tax. Conservatives look like they've had an increase from the 95 seats they held to something like 122, as I heard tonight, and it looks like Trudeau will get close to but not quite 170. So I don't know whether you call this a win for common sense or not, but I think people are actually starting to see Trudeau for the sort of the front man, the facade of which he is as a leader. There's not much substance. Yeah,
exactly. And you know, I wait to hear all the lefties who constantly scream that Donald Trump didn't win the popular vote, but Hillary won the popular vote, therefore Donald Trump is illegitimate. I'm waiting for the same lefties to start saying, well, hang on, Andrew Scheer, the Conservative in Canada, won the popular vote, so Trudeau is illegitimate. I won't hold my breath, Peter, because I don't think that will be happening. So he's in minority government, and he'll probably be forming a minority government with an even more left-wing government. So I feel that if you're in Canada, whoa, you're in for some really tough times ahead. The good news is minority governments in Canada rarely last more than a couple of years.
That's true.
There's also this bloc Quebecois who are sort of now surging forward. And this is a kind of revamping, a kind of lipstick on the pig of Quebecan separatist movements. And they're saying, well, we stand for Quebec, but we don't want to secede yet. But maybe further down the track, but in the meantime, we're kind of sitting there as a big bloc. So you've got this real fracture in Canada between the lovies, who support climate change action, and the whole raft of progressive, hardcore left-wing policies, all the lovey stuff. But you've got, in certain areas, in the rural areas, you've got these, like Ontario and Alberta, huge populations that are fed up with this stuff. They want to get rid of the carbon taxes. They want to get away from progressive policies. And then, of course, you've got this Quebec thing happening. So it's not happy days ahead for Justin Trudeau. And you know, when your entire program is we're going to do more on climate change, and the party you're going into power with, this new Democratic mob, they're saying, oh, we've got to do even more on climate change. So you've got two parties forming a coalition who are desperate. It's like Labor and the Greens forming a coalition. It ain't going to end well for the farmers, certainly, of Canada, but for, you know, the mainstream people of Canada are going to find their economy suffering under hardcore policies.
And the resource industry too. The resource industry.
Absolutely.
It reminds me very much of the marriage of convenience between Julia Gillard and Rob Brown when she was in the hung parliament period. And, of course, Canada... the energy debate is not esoteric there. It gets bloody cold in Canada. They need their heating, they need their energy, and people just aren't copying the costs of increases. When we saw in Alberta, we saw in Ontario, governments that came in, Conservative governments, they call themselves something different over there, but Conservative governments promising to repeal carbon taxes, the state or the provincial carbon taxes, were elected very, very comprehensively. So this got a long way to play out.
Yeah.
I want to bring you to some issues closer to home. I'll play something from Peter Dutton on the issue of these ISIL brides, because we saw a poll today that almost 60% of Australians, you and I could have told them, don't waste your money on the poll, don't waste your money on the poll, do not want these women home, regardless of the fact that they have young children. They're a pretty hard line. Only 15% was strongly supportive of bringing them home, only 15% of Australians. But let's have a listen to Peter Dutton.
It's a tragedy, and it upsets me that mothers or fathers would put their children into this situation. But people have left our shores consciously, in some cases with their children, or had children over there, knowing exactly wide-eyed what they were going into. And I've got advice from the agencies about certain individuals there who pose a definite national security terrorist threat if they return to our country. Do I want them back? Frankly, for a lot of them, I don't.
All right, mate, I was working for the Prime Minister when many of these women went overseas, and they went overseas knowing exactly what they were going overseas to do. to be married off to a bloke they most likely had not met. They might have Skyped a few times, but that'd be about it. To get pregnant, to bear the cubs of the caliphate, to populate Islamic State children and fighters into regions that they had run over militarily, at least. And these women knew exactly what they were doing. So this idea that we should feel sorry for them, that somehow we let them come home, Dutton wants to have them DNA tested, even if they come back to Australia. But they're no ingenues. You know, they're no naive woman who suddenly got a plane thinking she was going to Heathrow and suddenly found herself in the middle of Syria.
Well, precisely, Peter. I mean, we all saw the photos, the Australian boy holding up a decapitated head of a Syrian fighter. Absolutely disgusting stuff. People being burned alive in cages, people being executed, beheaded on beaches. We all saw the footage of Yazidi women being raped and put into enforced slavery. So no one is under any illusion whatsoever what ISIS and what extremist Islamic State terrorists are all about. So if you voluntarily go into that environment, there has to be, I mean, we talk about multiculturalism, it has to be a two-way street. You can't just have a world in which you let everyone into your country, but if they decide, oh, hang on, actually, no, we're going to go and involve ourselves in barbaric practices over there for a while, oh, but we can always come back again. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. And the majority of Australians, I'm surprised it was only 60%. I would have thought it was much higher, but I imagine many people were too frightened to say what they really thought to the pollsters, which is normally the case. But, you know, Australians aren't going to accept these people coming back in purely and simply because of the threat it then poses to us and our children. You know, if you're bringing people in who voluntarily agreed to participate in this sort of barbaric activity, it's not up to Australia to say, come back, all is forgiven, you know, we'll send you to a few group therapy sessions you can sit around and it'll all be fantastic after that. It's not up to us to accept that. And Peter Dutton's right, even to the extent of DNA testing. I think that's a very sensible idea, because who knows who you're going to be letting in if you don't do that.
Yeah, and I tell you, every time Christina Keneally opens her mouth on this issue, she just strengthens
Yes.
things for the coalition. We could stay there all night on the topic of Christina Keneally, but we will move on. Rowan Dean, thanks very much for your time tonight.
Thanks, Peter.